Welcome to Listening History Sleepy. Tonight we journey to a moment when Rome stood on the edge of annihilation, when Hannibal Barca had shattered every army sent against him, when the Republic's survival seemed impossible and its destruction seemed inevitable, when the city that would eventually rule the Mediterranean world was reduced to counting its dead and wondering if tomorrow would bring the final catastrophe. This is the story of the man who saved Rome from Hannibal, who defeated Carthage when defeat seemed Rome's only destiny, who transformed Roman warfare and proved that the legions could adapt and learn and overcome even the greatest tactical genius the ancient world had produced. This is the story of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. The name is perhaps less famous than it should be. Julius Caesar is known to everyone, Augustus is remembered. Even Pompey and Cicero have name recognition among those with passing interest in Roman history. But Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal at Zama, who saved Rome during its darkest hour, who revolutionized Roman military tactics, and demonstrated that Roman commanders could match or exceed their enemies' strategic and tactical brilliance. This man is often forgotten or reduced to footnote in histories focused on the later Republic and the empire that followed. The obscurity is partly because Scipio lived 2 centuries before Caesar, lived in an era when Roman records were less complete and Roman historiography was less developed, lived before the great literary flowering that would produce Cicero and Livy, and the writers who shaped how we remember Rome. But the obscurity is also because Scipio's story is uncomfortable, challenges the narratives that Rome wanted to tell about itself, reveals contradictions between Republican ideology and the reality of how Rome actually survived and conquered and built the empire that would dominate the Western world. The story begins with catastrophe. In 218 BCE, Hannibal crossed the Alps with an army that included war elephants, descended into Italy, and proceeded to destroy every Roman army sent against him. The battles have names that echo through military history: Trebia, where Hannibal ambushed Roman forces in winter cold; Lake Trasimene, where he trapped an entire Roman army against the lake and slaughtered them almost to the last man; Cannae, where he executed the perfect double envelopment, surrounding and destroying a Roman army of 70,000 men in the deadliest day in Roman military history. After Cannae, Rome's situation was desperate. Half of Italy's cities had defected to Hannibal. The Roman military system was in ruins. The confidence that had built the Republic and conquered Italy was shattered. Many expected Rome to sue for peace, to accept Carthaginian terms, to acknowledge that the war was lost and that continuing to fight would only increase the casualties without changing the outcome. But Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused to negotiate with Hannibal while he remained on Italian soil, refused to acknowledge defeat despite the catastrophes, refused to accept that the war was lost even when all evidence suggested exactly that. The refusal to surrender created space for something remarkable, created the conditions where a young Roman noble could learn from defeat, could study why Hannibal kept winning, could understand that Roman tactical orthodoxy was insufficient and that new methods were needed, could transform himself from the teenage boy who rescued his wounded father at Ticinus into the commander who would defeat Hannibal at Zama and save Rome from destruction. Scipio's rise was not inevitable. He was young, too young by Roman standards for the commands he would receive. He was unconventional, adopted tactics and strategies that violated Roman military tradition, that made conservative senators nervous, that suggested dangerous independence from the collective wisdom that supposedly guided Republican decision-making. He was popular, loved by his soldiers in ways that threatened the Senate's authority, that created personal loyalty to the commander rather than institutional loyalty to the state, that looked disturbingly like the relationship between a king and his followers rather than the relationship between a magistrate and citizen soldiers serving the Republic. But Scipio was also brilliant, was capable of learning from enemies, of adapting foreign tactics to Roman strengths, of thinking strategically at the highest level while managing tactical details that determined battles' outcomes, was able to inspire loyalty through genuine care for his soldiers' welfare rather than through the fear and discipline that traditionally motivated Roman armies. He was willing to take risks that more cautious commanders avoided, to gamble on audacious strategies that could win the war but that could also end in catastrophic defeat if they failed. The story we tell tonight is of Scipio's journey from the boy who saved his father to the general who saved Rome, from the student of Hannibal's victories to the commander who defeated Hannibal using lessons learned from those victories, from the young officer without experience to the conqueror of Carthage, whose cognomen Africanus proclaimed his greatest achievement. But the story is also about what happened after the victory, about how Rome treated the man who saved it, about the gratitude that became suspicion and the honors that became accusations and the triumph that became exile. The tragedy of Scipio is that he was too successful for Republican Rome to handle, was too brilliant for a system that insisted all citizens were equal, was too essential for a state that claimed no individual was irreplaceable. His victories proved that sometimes individual genius matters more than institutional wisdom, that sometimes breaking the rules produces better results than following them, that sometimes the Republic's salvation requires concentration of power in ways that Republican ideology could not tolerate even when that concentration saved the system from destruction. We will walk with Scipio through fire and blood at Ticinus, through the despair after Cannae, through the vow that bound him to Rome's defense, through the Spanish campaigns that proved his tactical brilliance, through the African invasion that everyone said was impossible, through the final confrontation with Hannibal at Zama where student defeated master, through the triumph that became the beginning of his political destruction. Through the exile that he chose rather than tearing Rome apart through factional conflict over his role and his power and his legacy. The journey is military history, but is also meditation on greatness and how societies respond to it, on heroism and how republics reward it, on the price of salvation and the cost of being irreplaceable. Scipio saved Rome, but Rome could not save Scipio from the suspicion that genius inspires in those who know they are not geniuses, from the fear that exceptional individuals create in systems built on the assumption that no one is exceptional, from the political dynamics that demand that even saviors must be brought down to ensure that no one becomes too powerful, too popular, too dangerous to the collective governance that republican ideology requires. The night is long, the story is complex, the lessons are uncomfortable. We will not simplify, will not make Scipio into pure hero or Rome into pure villain, will acknowledge that both the man and the state were complicated, that both had virtues and failings, that both were trapped in contradictions that neither could fully resolve. We will sit with the tragedy of the hero whom the republic he saved could not honor without betraying its principles, with the savior whom the nation he rescued rewarded with suspicion and exile, with the victor who conquered Carthage but who could not conquer the political dynamics that made Rome unable to properly acknowledge what it owed him. Come, the battlefield waits. The teenage boy rides toward his wounded father through chaos and death. The long journey from that moment to Zama to exile begins. Scipio calls across 22 centuries not the legend but the man, not the triumph but the tragedy, not the simple story of victory but the complex reality of what victory cost and what it meant, and why the greatest Roman general of his age died in voluntary exile from the city he had saved. The general who conquered Carthage and conquered silence. His story begins. The battlefield at Ticinus stretches beneath an iron sky, the river flowing swift and cold through late autumn landscape where frost touches the grass and breath steams in the air, where the trees are mostly bare and the ground is hard and the conditions favor neither army particularly but favor the defender slightly, favor those who hold position rather than those who must attack. But neither army is defending, both are maneuvering, both are seeking advantage, both are testing each other in this early phase of a war that will consume Italy for 16 years, that will kill hundreds of thousands, that will bring Rome to the edge of dissolution, and will prove that Roman military supremacy is not inevitable, that the legions can be defeated. That Carthage under Hannibal's command represents existential threat to the republic that conquered peninsular Italy, but that has never faced an enemy like this. The Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of our subject, commander of the army, representative of senatorial authority and traditional Roman military wisdom, has led his forces north to intercept Hannibal, to prevent the Carthaginian army from descending into the Po Valley, to demonstrate Roman resolve, and to reassure the Gallic tribes that Rome remains powerful despite Hannibal's successful Alpine crossing. The consul's army is not the massive force that will later be assembled at Cannae, is cavalry and light troops suitable for rapid maneuver, is force designed to scout and harass and delay rather than to fight pitched battle against Hannibal's main strength. But Hannibal has no intention of being delayed, has come to Italy to destroy Rome, has crossed the Alps with the explicit purpose of bringing war to Roman territory, of demonstrating that Rome is vulnerable, of encouraging Rome's allies to defect and Rome's enemies to attack, of creating the conditions where Carthage can dictate terms rather than accepting them. When the Roman cavalry encounters Carthaginian cavalry near the Ticinus, the skirmish escalates, the forces engage. The battle that neither commander particularly wanted becomes the battle that both must fight because contact has been made and because backing down would signal weakness that neither can afford. The Carthaginian cavalry is superior, better trained, better mounted, more experienced in the kind of fluid combat that cavalry excels at, commanded by Hannibal, who understands cavalry tactics at the highest level, and who has brought Numidian horsemen who are among the finest light cavalry in the ancient world. The Roman cavalry fights bravely but is overmatched, begins to give ground, begins to break as the Carthaginian advantage in skill and experience tells, begins to panic as panic spreads through cavalry that realizes it is losing, that the enemy is better, that continuing to fight may mean death or capture rather than the victory that Roman pride assumes is their birthright. The consul fights in the front ranks. This is Roman tradition, is what commanders do, is how they earn the right to command by demonstrating personal courage and by sharing the dangers that they order their men to face. But the tradition has costs. The consul is wounded, struck by javelin or sword or spear. Sources disagree on details but agree on outcome. He falls, is separated from his bodyguard, is surrounded by enemies who recognize the value of capturing or killing a Roman consul, who press forward to finish what they have started, to take the prize that will demoralize the Roman army and that will demonstrate Carthaginian superiority not just tactically but symbolically. This is the moment. This is when a teenage boy becomes legend, when Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, our Scipio, the subject of our story, 17 years old or perhaps younger, sees his father fall, sees the consul surrounded, sees the moment when everything could end, when the war could be lost before it truly begins, when personal catastrophe and political disaster converge in single instant that admits no time for thought or deliberation or caution. He does not hesitate, does not calculate odds or consider consequences or recognize the madness of what he is about to do. He rallies a handful of cavalrymen, friends, companions, other young nobles serving their first campaigns, and charges into the maelstrom. The charge is suicide by any rational calculation. The Carthaginians are overwhelming the position, have numerical superiority in that specific location, have momentum and confidence and the scent of victory. A handful of teenage Romans charging into that situation should accomplish nothing except adding their names to the casualty lists, should die bravely but uselessly, should prove that courage without experience is merely a faster way to reach the same inevitable defeat. But courage sometimes transcends calculation, sometimes achieves what cold analysis says is impossible, sometimes creates the confusion or the shock or the moment of hesitation that allows the impossible to happen. The young Romans crash into the Carthaginians surrounding the fallen consul. The impact creates chaos. The Carthaginians were focused on finishing their prey, were not expecting renewed assault from direction they thought they had cleared, were not prepared for the desperate fury of sons protecting father, of young men willing to die to save their commander. In the confusion, in the handful of seconds before Carthaginian numbers can overwhelm the rescue party, the wounded consul is lifted, is carried back toward Roman lines, is extracted from the killing zone and brought to relative safety where his wounds can be tended and where he can survive to command another day. The rescue is small moment in a catastrophic defeat. The Battle of Ticinus is Roman loss, demonstrates that Carthaginian cavalry is superior, forces the consul to withdraw, allows Hannibal to continue his advance into Italy, changes nothing about the strategic situation except to confirm what anyone paying attention already knew. Hannibal is formidable opponent, his army is dangerous, his cavalry gives him advantages that Roman forces cannot easily counter. The war will continue, will escalate, will produce catastrophes that make Ticinus look like minor skirmish, will bring Rome to the brink of annihilation. But the moment matters. Matters because it reveals something about the boy who will become Africanus, something about the character that will later shake empires, something about the courage that does not calculate but simply acts, the loyalty that values personal bonds above personal safety, the tactical audacity that sees opportunities where others see only impossible odds. The teenage Scipio who rides through Carthaginian cavalry to save his father is not yet the general who will revolutionize Roman warfare, is not yet the strategist who will defeat Hannibal, is not yet the conqueror of Carthage. Is only a boy doing what seems right in the moment, what love demands, what honor requires. We trace the path through fire and blood, through the chaos where men scream and horses scream and metal strikes metal and flesh and the air smells of blood and fear and death, through the moment when fear should paralyze but instead crystallizes into action, when the instinct to flee transforms into the will to fight, when survival becomes less important than saving the person whose life gave you life. The rescue succeeds. The consul survives. The boy who saved him will remember this moment, will carry it forward, will build upon it the career that will define his life and will save his nation. But in the moment there is only action and consequence, only the charge and the extraction and the desperate ride back to safety. Only the consul wounded and bleeding but alive, only the son who refused to watch his father die, only the handful of young Romans who followed him into impossible odds and who somehow survived to tell the story. The battlefield empties as armies withdraw, as the wounded are gathered and the dead are left for burial details, as the engagement ends and both sides assess what happened and what it means. For Rome, it means that Hannibal is as dangerous as feared, that the Carthaginian cavalry is superior to Roman horsemen, that the war will be harder than optimists hoped, that victories will not come easily or quickly. For the Scipio family, it means that the father survives to fight again, that the son has demonstrated courage that will be remembered and honored, that the bonds between father and son have been tested in fire and have proven unbreakable. For the young Scipio himself, it means that he has walked through fire and emerged, has faced death and has not flinched, has learned that courage can accomplish what calculation says is impossible, that sometimes the only way forward is through the chaos, that sometimes saving what matters requires risking everything. The lesson will serve him well in the years ahead, in the campaigns and battles and desperate moments that will come, in the decisions that will require courage to execute and that will determine Rome's fate. But for now, there is only the aftermath, the exhaustion, the relief of survival, the knowledge that today was survived and tomorrow will bring new dangers, new challenges, new moments when courage will be required and when failure might mean more than personal death, might mean the end of everything. The boy who walked through fire, the son who saved his father, the moment when character was tested and proved true. The beginning of a legend that will grow through decades of war, that will culminate in triumph and tragedy, that will save Rome and will demonstrate Rome's inability to honor its savior without fearing him, without suspecting him, without eventually driving him into exile, that he will choose rather than dividing the republic between those who love him and those who fear him. The fire is crossed. The battlefield is left behind. The war continues. And the boy begins becoming the general, begins learning the lessons that Hannibal will teach in the catastrophes that follow, begins the transformation from brave son to brilliant commander, from young noble to savior of Rome, from Publius Cornelius Scipio to Scipio Africanus, the man who will defeat Carthage and who will be defeated by the republic he saved. Rome trembles. The news arrives in waves, each report worse than the last, each messenger bringing catastrophe that exceeds what came before, each disaster building upon previous disasters until the cumulative weight seems unbearable, seems like divine punishment or cosmic injustice or simple proof that Rome has met an enemy it cannot defeat, a commander it cannot match, a force that will not stop until the Republic is destroyed. Hannibal has crossed the Alps, not just crossed, but crossed with elephants, crossed through passes where no army that size should be able to move, crossed despite winter cold and hostile tribes and terrain that should have destroyed his forces before they ever reached Italy. The crossing itself is achievement that contemporaries struggle to understand, that seems to violate the natural order, that transforms Hannibal from dangerous enemy into something approaching supernatural threat, into force that accomplishes the impossible as prelude to attempting the unthinkable, the conquest of Rome itself. But the Alpine crossing is only beginning. Once in Italy, Hannibal proceeds to demonstrate that the crossing was not desperate gamble that exhausted his army, but was strategic maneuver that positioned him perfectly to exploit Roman weaknesses, to turn the legion's strengths against them, to fight on his terms rather than theirs. At the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, Hannibal lures the Romans into attacking across a freezing river, allows them to exhaust themselves wading through waist-deep water in winter cold, then envelops them with cavalry and with troops he had hidden in ambush, destroys a consular army, and demonstrates that Roman tactical orthodoxy is vulnerable to commander who understands deception and terrain and timing. The defeat is shocking but not yet catastrophic. One army lost, but Rome has more. One consul defeated, but the other survives. The system stressed but not broken. The confidence shaken but not shattered. Then comes Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE, where Hannibal demonstrates that Trebia was not lucky victory but was preview of method, of systematic exploitation of Roman weaknesses, of tactical brilliance that consistently outthinks Roman commanders. He positions his army along the northern shore of the lake, conceals his forces in the morning fog, waits for the Roman army under Gaius Flaminius to march into the killing zone along the narrow path between the hills and the water. When the Romans are committed, when they cannot retreat and cannot deploy, when they are strung out in marching column rather than in battle formation, Hannibal's troops emerge from the fog and attack from the hillside, drive the Romans toward the lake, trap them between Carthaginian forces and the water, slaughter them almost to the last man. Flaminius dies fighting. This is small honor in comprehensive disaster, is commander doing his duty by dying with his men, but it does not change the outcome. If 15,000 Romans die at Lake Trasimene, thousands more are captured, an entire consular army is destroyed in a single morning's ambush, and Rome begins to understand that it faces not merely dangerous enemy but faces tactical genius, faces commander who is consistently several steps ahead, who sees opportunities that Roman commanders miss, who turns Roman confidence into vulnerability and Roman strengths into exploitable weaknesses. The Senate responds by appointing Fabius Maximus as dictator, temporary position with extraordinary powers, designed for emergencies, intended to concentrate authority to deal with crisis. Fabius understands what Flaminius did not, recognizes that fighting Hannibal on Hannibal's terms is suicide, adopts strategy of shadowing the Carthaginian army without engaging it, harassing its foragers, cutting off stragglers, denying battle while slowly wearing down Hannibal's forces through attrition, and through denying him the decisive victory that would break Roman will and would force capitulation. The strategy is wise but is unpopular. Romans want vengeance, want victory, want to prove that Trebia and Trasimene were aberrations rather than indicators of fundamental Carthaginian superiority. The people resent Fabius's caution, call him the delayer as insult rather than compliment, demand action rather than patience, pressure the Senate to replace defensive strategy with offensive campaign that will destroy Hannibal and will restore Roman honor. The Senate yields to pressure, appoints consuls who promise aggressive approach, raises the largest army Rome has ever fielded, 80,000 infantry and cavalry, concentrates Roman military power for single decisive blow that will end the war and will prove that Rome is still invincible when it commits fully. At Cannae in August 216 BCE, Hannibal destroys them. The battle becomes textbook example of perfect tactical execution, becomes the engagement that military academies will study for 2 millennia as demonstration of how inferior numbers can defeat superior force through superior generalship. Hannibal arranges his infantry in crescent formation, weak in the center and strong on the wings, positions his cavalry on the flanks, allows the Roman infantry to push forward in the center where they have advantage, lets them drive his center back while his wings hold, then closes the wings around the advancing Romans while his cavalry defeats the Roman horsemen and circles back to attack the Roman infantry from behind. The result is encirclement, is annihilation, is 70,000 Romans killed in single day's slaughter, is catastrophe so complete that Rome's survival becomes questionable, is defeat so comprehensive that many contemporaries expect Rome to seek peace, to accept whatever terms Carthage offers, to acknowledge that continuing the war is pointless when Hannibal has proven he can destroy every army Rome sends against him. The numbers are difficult to comprehend even now. 70,000 dead in one day, more than the United States lost in 8 years of Vietnam, roughly equivalent to British casualties on the first day of the Somme, achieved with swords and spears and the kind of hand-to-hand combat that requires men to kill each other close enough to smell each other's breath and feel each other's blood splashing warm across armor and skin. The psychological impact exceeds even the staggering casualties. Rome has lost not just an army but has lost confidence, has lost the assumption that Roman courage and discipline guarantee victory, has lost the belief that the Republic is destined to triumph because its cause is just and its soldiers are brave and its gods favor its expansion. Hannibal has proven that courage is insufficient, that discipline alone cannot overcome superior tactics, that the gods either do not favor Rome or do not intervene to prevent the disasters that Carthaginian genius inflicts. In this silence after defeat, in this space where despair would be reasonable and surrender would be understandable, something remarkable happens. Rome does not surrender. The Senate refuses to negotiate with Hannibal while he remains on Italian soil, refuses to ransom prisoners even though this means condemning thousands of Roman citizens to slavery or death, refuses to acknowledge that the war is lost despite all evidence suggesting exactly that. The refusal is not based on rational calculation of odds or careful assessment of remaining military resources or clear path to victory. It is based on stubborn determination that surrendering is unacceptable regardless of cost, that Rome will continue fighting even if continuing means losing everything, that the Republic will not bow to Carthage even when bowing would prevent further catastrophes. Young Scipio is in the city when the news arrives, is among those who receive reports of the magnitude of disaster, is part of senatorial class that must decide how Rome responds, is present when some nobles begin speaking quietly, cautiously, but speaking nonetheless of abandoning Italy, of evacuating to Sicily or Spain or some other province, of building new lives in territories where Carthaginian vengeance cannot reach. The thought is treason, is abandonment of sacred duty, is violation of everything Roman citizenship means. But the thought is also human response to catastrophe, is recognition that continuing to fight a war you cannot win is choosing death over survival, is sacrificing everything for a cause that may already be lost. Scipio learns in this silence. Studies the defeats, asks questions about what happened and how Hannibal won, tries to understand the tactical decisions that led to disaster, begins to see patterns in Carthaginian success and Roman failure. Watches how Hannibal uses cavalry, how he employs terrain, how he creates situations where Roman strengths become weaknesses, how he makes the enemy fight on his terms rather than their own, how he turns Roman confidence and aggression into exploitable vulnerabilities. The lessons are painful but are invaluable, are taught in blood but are learned in contemplation, are written in the bodies of 70,000 Romans but are read by the young man who will eventually use those lessons to defeat the teacher. The defeats teach what victory never could teach: humility, teach that Rome's traditional methods are insufficient against superior enemy, teach that adapting and learning from opponents is not shameful but is necessary for survival, teach that the way things have always been done is not sacred truth, but is merely method that works until it meets method that works better. The silence after defeat is where wisdom grows, where the recognition that we do not know becomes the beginning of knowing, where loss becomes teacher more profound than any triumph, where catastrophe creates space for transformation that success would never permit. We sit in that silence with Scipio, feeling the weight of Roman dead, carrying the burden of catastrophe, understanding that sometimes destruction must precede creation, that sometimes everything must break before it can be rebuilt stronger, that sometimes the greatest teachers are the enemies who defeat us and thereby force us to learn what we were too arrogant to learn when we were winning. The sacred silence of defeat, the pause before transformation. The moment when young Scipio begins becoming the commander who will save Rome, begins learning the lessons that will enable him to defeat Hannibal, begins the education that will cost tens of thousands of Roman lives, but that will produce the general who will finally match and exceed the Carthaginian master. The silence settles, the city mourns, the war continues. And in the mourning and the continuing, in the refusal to surrender and the determination to learn, Rome begins the slow transformation from victim to victor, from army that loses to army that adapts, from republic that will be destroyed to republic that will destroy Carthage, from defeated power to triumphant empire. The transformation begins in silence, begins in defeat, begins in the willingness to acknowledge that the old ways have failed and that new ways must be found. It begins with Scipio studying defeat and understanding that defeat is not permanent condition, but is temporary state that can be overcome through learning and adaptation and the courage to do what has never been done before. The sacred silence, where wisdom waits, where transformation begins. In a chamber lit by oil lamps whose flames cast dancing shadows on marble walls, where the air is heavy with incense meant to purify space and thoughts, where the darkness beyond the lamplight seems to press inward like physical weight, young Roman nobles gather in secret after the disaster at Cana. They are the sons of senators, the heirs to great families, the young men who represent Rome's future if Rome has a future, who should be planning political careers and advantageous marriages and the accumulation of wealth and honors that define successful Roman life. Instead, they are contemplating treason, are speaking words that should never be spoken, are considering abandonment that would make them exiles and outcasts and would end their family's honor along with their own prospects. The disaster at Cana has broken something in these young men, has shattered the confidence that came from growing up in the republic that conquered peninsular Italy, that seemed invincible because it had never been seriously challenged, that assumed its continued expansion was destiny rather than contingent outcome of specific circumstances that could change when circumstances changed. 70,000 Romans dead in a single day, the number is incomprehensible, is more than entire armies in most ancient battles, is catastrophe that equals or exceeds the total losses in some entire wars. Among the dead are fathers and uncles and brothers and cousins and friends, are the men who commanded legions and who formed the officer corps and who represented Roman military leadership. The Republic has lost not just soldiers but has lost experience, has lost the institutional knowledge that professional armies maintain, has lost the relationships and trust that make military organizations function effectively. The army that died at Cana cannot be quickly replaced, can raise new legions, can recruit new soldiers, can appoint new officers, but cannot create the cohesion and experience and mutual trust that develop over years of campaigning together, that make units effective rather than merely numerous. Rome will need years to rebuild what was lost in hours at Cana, will need to train new legions and develop new commanders and hope that Hannibal allows them the time to recover before he strikes the final blow. But will there be time? Hannibal is in Italy, has destroyed every army Rome has sent against him, has demonstrated tactical genius that Roman commanders cannot match, has allies among the southern Italian cities that have defected after Cana, has momentum and has the initiative and appears unstoppable. The logical conclusion is that Rome will fall, maybe not immediately. Maybe Hannibal will need another year or two to consolidate his conquests and to gather strength for the siege of Rome itself. But fall Rome will, because nothing in the military situation suggests that Rome can prevent what seems inevitable. So some of the young nobles begin speaking of alternatives. They speak quietly, cautiously, testing how others respond, probing to see who shares their despair and their willingness to consider the previously unthinkable. Speak of abandoning Italy, of taking ship to Sicily or to Spain or to some other Roman province, of building new lives in territories where they can be safe from Carthaginian vengeance, where they can preserve themselves and their families even if Rome itself falls, where they can survive to perhaps someday return and rebuild if opportunity arises, but where at least they will not be among those who die when Hannibal finally comes to the city. The thoughts are reasonable in purely practical terms. If Rome is doomed, if Hannibal cannot be stopped, if continuing to resist merely increases the casualties without changing the outcome, then evacuation is rational choice, is accepting reality and adapting to it, is choosing life over pointless death in defense of cause that is already lost. But the thoughts are also treason, our violation of the most fundamental obligation that Roman citizenship imposes, our abandonment of the city and the gods and the ancestors, and everything that makes Romans Roman rather than merely people who happen to live in Italy. The room fills with tension as the forbidden words are spoken, as the unthinkable is thought aloud, as young men who have been raised to value honor above life contemplate dishonor as price of survival, as the choice between loyalty and life becomes explicit rather than remaining comfortable abstraction that could be discussed philosophically without requiring actual decision. Some of the young nobles seem to agree with the evacuation plan, seem to think that survival is more important than honor when honor means dying for lost cause, seem ready to take ship and abandon Rome to whatever fate Hannibal has planned for it. Then Scipio enters. He is young like the others, is barely into his 20s, has no official authority over these nobles who are his social equals or superiors, has no right to command them or to judge them or to demand anything from them. But he carries a drawn sword, carries it openly, not sheathed, not hidden, carries it in a way that makes clear that the blade is not decorative but is functional, is ready to be used, is present for a purpose that will become clear shortly. The room falls silent as he enters, as the young men see the sword and understand that whatever they were discussing is about to become more serious, more immediate, more dangerous than philosophical debate about hypothetical options. Scipio does not argue with them, does not explain why abandoning Rome is wrong, does not appeal to their honor or their patriotism or their duty to ancestors and gods. Instead, he makes oath, speaks words that transform intention into vow, that bind him through sacred pledge that cannot be broken without becoming oath-breaker, without violating the most fundamental religious and social obligations that Romans recognize. He swears by Jupiter and by the gods of Rome that he will never abandon the city, will never desert Italy, will fight until death or victory regardless of how hopeless the situation seems, regardless of how many armies Hannibal destroys, regardless of what catastrophes still await. The oath is absolute, is unconditional, is commitment without escape clauses or reservations or conditions that would allow him to reconsider if circumstances change. But Scipio does not stop with his own oath. Demands that the others swear the same oath, makes the choice explicit and binary, eliminates the middle ground where they could remain undecided or could privately plan evacuation while publicly claiming loyalty. The sword is not raised in threat, but the implication is clear. Those who will not swear the oath are declaring themselves traitors, are announcing their intention to abandon Rome, are making themselves enemies who must be stopped before they can flee, and whose flight would demoralize those who remain and would give Hannibal propaganda victory even before military victory is complete. The young nobles understand. One by one they swear, speaking the same oath that Scipio spoke, binding themselves to Rome's defense regardless of cost, accepting that they will die in Italy if Italy cannot be saved but will not abandon it while they live, will not take the path of safety and survival that seemed attractive moments before but that now seems impossible because honor and oath and the naked blade witnessing their words all combine to make evacuation not merely wrong but unthinkable. The oaths are sworn. The sword witnesses. The moment passes from possibility into sacred obligation, from thought into vow, from private discussion into public commitment that cannot be retracted without breaking faith with gods and with each other. The oath transforms the young men, changes them from nobles contemplating treason into defenders bound by sacred pledge, from individuals calculating personal interest into members of collective committed to common cause, from Romans considering whether Rome is worth saving into Romans who have pledged their lives to saving it regardless of whether it can be saved or whether the attempt will cost everything. The transformation is not rational. There is no logical reason why speaking words over naked blade should change what is strategically wise or tactically feasible or practically possible. But the transformation is real nonetheless, is psychological shift that makes previously thinkable options unthinkable, that creates commitment that will sustain these men through years of war still to come, that will make them willing to endure defeats and losses and catastrophes without considering surrender, because surrender has been made literally impossible by oath that cannot be broken. Scipio's action reveals something about leadership, about how humans are motivated, about the difference between rational calculation and sacred commitment, about why armies follow commanders who inspire devotion rather than commanders who merely give orders based on sound military judgment. The oath creates bond that transcends tactical considerations, creates loyalty that survives defeat, creates determination that cannot be broken by setbacks because the commitment is not conditional on success but is absolute regardless of outcome. The young men who swear this oath will follow Scipio later, will serve under him in Spain and Africa, will be the core of the army that defeats Carthage, will prove that loyalty created through shared commitment is stronger than loyalty created through discipline or fear or material reward. We witness the moment when personal choice becomes cosmic necessity, when private will merges with public duty, when the individual dissolves into something larger nation, cause, purpose that transcends survival and pleasure and the natural human desire to live at any cost. The moment is sacred in the Roman sense, is moment when humans enter into relationship with divine through oath-taking, is moment when the gods become witnesses to promises that now have supernatural as well as social enforcement, is moment when breaking faith becomes not merely practical betrayal but becomes spiritual violation that endangers the oath-breaker's relationship with divine powers that govern fate and fortune and the order that keeps chaos at bay. The lamps burn lower. The shadows deepen. The young men file out one by one, each changed by what has happened, each bound now by chains stronger than iron, each committed to Rome's defense through vow that will shape the rest of their lives. Scipio remains a moment longer, alone with the sword that witnessed the oaths, alone with the weight of what he has done, has bound these men to cause that may be doomed, has demanded their lives in service of city that may fall despite their sacrifice, has created obligations that will cost some of them everything and will profit them nothing if Rome falls, as seems likely. But the sword is sheathed, the oath is given, the commitment is made. And in the making, something shifts, not in the military situation, not in the strategic balance, not in the objective factors that determine whether Rome can survive Hannibal's onslaught. What shifts is internal, is in the young men who swore, and in the spirit of the city that will learn of their oath, is in the determination that will sustain resistance when resistance seems pointless, is in the refusal to accept that defeat is inevitable even when all evidence suggests exactly that. The vow carved in starlight, the oath that binds deeper than chains, the moment when despair transforms into determination, when contemplated treason becomes sacred commitment, when Rome's future stops being question mark and becomes obligation that these young men will fulfill or die attempting. The chamber empties, the lamps gutter, the oath endures. Scipio asks for Spain. The request is audacious, is request for command that normally would go to consul or to proconsul with years of experience, is asking for army and for authority and for the opportunity to prove himself in independent command, far from senatorial oversight and from the traditional constraints that limit how Roman commanders operate. He is 25 years old, or perhaps slightly older, has served as military tribune but has never commanded legions, has distinguished himself at Ticinus and has survived Canna but has no victories to his name, has nothing in his resume that would normally qualify him for the command he seeks except for one thing. His father and uncle were killed in Spain while commanding Roman forces there, were defeated and slaughtered by Carthaginian armies, were martyrs to the cause of contesting Hannibal's supply base in Iberia. The request is also strategic. Spain is where Carthage draws resources that sustain Hannibal's army in Italy, silver from the mines, soldiers from the Iberian tribes, supplies and reinforcements that flow across the sea from Spanish ports to Italian landing sites. If Carthage can be expelled from Spain, if that supply base can be cut, then Hannibal's position in Italy becomes precarious, becomes unsustainable over the long term, becomes vulnerable to the kind of war of attrition that Fabius advocated, the slow grinding down of an army that cannot be reinforced or resupplied, and that must eventually weaken and withdraw or risk being trapped and destroyed by Roman forces that grow stronger while Carthaginian forces grow weaker. But Spain is also where Rome has failed repeatedly, is where 2 Roman commanders have been killed, is where Carthaginian control seems secure, and where attempting to contest that control has proven costly and ineffective. The Senate is skeptical. They have limited forces available, have just suffered catastrophic losses at Canna, have Hannibal in Italy demanding their attention and resources, have little enthusiasm for opening new front in Spain that will drain more troops and more money, and that may produce nothing except additional defeats that Rome can ill afford. Yet Rome is also desperate. The conventional strategies have failed, the traditional commanders have proven unable to match Hannibal. The defensive approach that Fabius advocated has prevented further catastrophic defeats, but has not forced Hannibal to leave Italy and shows no prospect of doing so anytime soon. Something different is needed, some strategy that changes the dynamic rather than merely trying to minimize losses, while hoping that Hannibal eventually exhausts himself or loses interest or faces problems at home that force him to withdraw. Scipio's proposal offers different approach, attacking Carthage's resources rather than attacking Carthage's armies, forcing Hannibal to operate on reduced supplies rather than trying to defeat him in battle where he has proven invincible, playing the long game where Roman staying power and resources can eventually overcome Carthaginian brilliance if that brilliance can be denied the material support it requires. The Senate debates, weighs the risks against potential benefits, considers whether Scipio can be trusted with independent command, considers whether sending another army to Spain is throwing good money after bad, or whether this time might be different because this commander is different, because youth brings audacity that experience might counsel against. Because sometimes the unexpected succeeds precisely because the enemy has prepared for the expected and is vulnerable to approaches that violate conventional wisdom. The debate is intense, but Rome's options are limited. They can continue doing what they have been doing and hope for different results, or they can try something new and accept that trying something new brings risks but also brings possibility of breakthrough that continuing current approach cannot provide. The Senate gives him the command. Not with enthusiasm, not with the full resources he wants, not with the official blessing that consular imperium would provide. They make him proconsul, grants him authority equivalent to consul, but without having held consulship, irregular appointment that reflects both the unusual circumstances and the lingering suspicion about giving so much power to someone so young and so unproven. They give him permission to recruit volunteers, will not assign him veteran legions because those are needed in Italy and because giving unproven commander Rome's best troops seems too risky, but will allow him to gather volunteers, to recruit from those willing to follow him, to build army from those who believe in him or in his plan, or who simply want to fight in Spain rather than facing Hannibal in Italy. Scipio crosses to Spain carrying not just military authority but carrying burden of expectation and doubt, carrying memory of his father and uncle who died there, carrying knowledge that failure will vindicate those who doubted him and will close off any future opportunities for independent command. That success is necessary not just for Rome's strategic position, but for his own political survival and future prospects. The crossing is both geographical and metaphorical, is crossing from Italy where Roman power is concentrated to Spain where Roman power has failed, is crossing from the space where traditional methods are practiced to space where innovation is necessary, is crossing from being young noble with potential to being commander whose decisions will determine men's fates and Rome's fortunes. The army he leads is not Rome's finest, is composed of volunteers and survivors from previous defeats, is troops who have reason to follow him but who have no reason to assume they will win, who know that Spain has been graveyard for Roman ambitions and who may well wonder if they are marching to their deaths, if Scipio's confidence is warranted, or is merely youthful arrogance that experience will painfully correct. But they follow nonetheless, motivated by Scipio's charisma or by the opportunity to avenge previous defeats or by the simple fact that someone needs to fight in Spain, and these are the men willing to do it, committed now to the campaign and to the commander and to the outcome whatever it may be. We follow the army across the sea, across the boundary between the known world and the territory where Carthage rules, into the space where Roman power has failed and where this untested commander will either vindicate Roman arms or will add his name to the list of those who died trying to do what could not be done. The water stretches blue and endless, the ships cut through swells that have existed longer than civilization. The soldiers watch the horizon wondering what waits beyond it, wondering if they will return from Spain or if their bones will join those of previous Roman armies that ventured into Iberia and never came home. The gamble is not just military but is personal. Is Scipio staking his reputation and his life and his family's honor on belief that conventional wisdom is wrong, that the enemy can be defeated through audacity rather than attrition, that speed and surprise can overcome superior numbers and defensive positions, that one perfect blow can accomplish what years of grinding warfare have failed to achieve? The gamble is also strategic. Is Rome betting that Spain can be taken, that Carthage can be expelled from Iberia, that the supply lines feeding Hannibal's army in Italy can be cut, that the war can be won not by defeating Hannibal directly, but by undermining the resources that make his continued operations possible? The Spanish coast appears on the horizon, brown cliffs rising from blue sea, land that has been fought over for centuries, that Carthaginians and Greeks and native Iberians have contested, that has seen empires rise and fall, that now will see whether Rome can succeed where it has previously failed, whether Scipio can accomplish what his father and uncle could not. Whether the gamble will pay off or whether Spain will claim another Roman army and another generation of Roman commanders who thought they could change what history suggested was unchangeable. The ships make landfall, the army disembarks, the campaign begins. And Scipio faces the challenge that will define him, not the challenge of fighting battles, though battles will come, but the challenge of command, of making decisions that determine whether men live or die, of living with those decisions' consequences, of balancing audacity with caution, of knowing when to risk everything and when to preserve forces, of becoming the commander that Rome needs him to be rather than the inexperienced young man that his age and resume suggest he is. The Spanish gamble. The crossing that cannot be uncrossed, the commitment that transforms possibility into necessity, that makes victory not just desirable but essential because failure is not merely strategic setback, but is personal catastrophe that will end career and reputation and perhaps life itself. Spain waits, the gamble is cast. The outcome remains hidden in future that no augury can reliably predict, that no calculation can guarantee, that only action and fortune and the gods' will and human effort can determine. New Carthage stands on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean like accusatory finger pointing at Rome, surrounded by walls on 3 sides and by the sea on the 4th, defended by garrison that Carthaginian commanders judge sufficient and by fortifications that Carthaginian engineers consider impregnable, stocked with supplies that could sustain a siege for months or years, serving as the administrative and military nerve center of Carthaginian power in Spain. Here tribute from Iberian tribes is collected, here hostages are held to ensure tribal cooperation, here the wealth that funds Hannibal's war in Italy is concentrated, here the ships that carry supplies and reinforcements to Italy are based, here the symbol and the substance of Carthaginian dominance over Iberia are located in single target that seems impossible to assault, but that represents opportunity if it can be taken. Scipio arrives with his legions after marching down the Spanish coast, after securing Roman positions in the north, after ensuring that his supply lines are protected and that his retreat route remains open if the campaign goes badly, after the careful preparation that distinguishes competent commanders from reckless ones, that shows he understands that audacity must be coupled with pragmatism. That boldness requires foundation of careful planning and attention to logistics and provision for contingencies that always arise when plans encounter reality. He establishes camp within sight of the city, begins the reconnaissance that precedes any siege, sends scouts to examine the walls and the approaches and the defenses, begins gathering intelligence that will determine whether assault is feasible and what form that assault should take. The conventional wisdom says the city cannot be taken quickly. The walls are strong, recently reinforced, built to resist siege engines and scaling ladders, defended by troops who know that holding New Carthage is essential to Carthaginian position in Spain, that losing it would be catastrophe that would undermine everything Carthage has built in Iberia. The garrison is sufficient to man the walls, to resist assault, to make any attempt at storming the city costly enough that even if it succeeds the attacker will be weakened, will have suffered casualties that reduce their ability to continue operations, will have won Pyrrhic victory that achieves objective at cost that makes achievement meaningless. But Scipio has information that conventional wisdom lacks. Has learned from local fishermen that the lagoon on the city's northern side, the body of water that the defenders consider natural moat that makes fortifications on that side unnecessary or minimal, is shallow at low tide, that men can wade across where ships cannot sail, that the obvious impossibility of crossing creates blind spot in defense, creates assumption that no one will attack from that direction because no one can attack from that direction. Creates vulnerability that careful observation and local knowledge can exploit. The information is not certain. Fishermen may be wrong, tides may be unpredictable, the lagoon's depth may vary in ways that locals do not understand or cannot communicate accurately. attempting to cross may result in troops drowning or getting stuck in mud or being caught halfway across when tide turns, may result in catastrophe that leaves half the assault force trapped in the lagoon while Carthaginian defenders massacre them from the walls. But the information is plausible, fits with what scouts can observe from distance, suggests approach that might achieve surprise, that might allow assault from direction that defenders are not prepared to resist, that might turn the impregnable city into vulnerable target if timing and execution are correct. Scipio plans the assault with care that accounts for the variables and the uncertainties, that creates conditions where even if the main plan fails, the army can withdraw without catastrophic losses, that uses the lagoon crossing as one element in comprehensive assault that attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, that forces defenders to divide their attention and their forces. That creates the chaos where breakthrough becomes possible because no defense can be strong everywhere when it must defend against attacks coming from all directions at once. He studies the tides, waits for the day when low tide coincides with the timing that gives him longest window for the crossing, when the water will be at its lowest, and when his troops will have maximum time to cross and assault the walls before tide returns and makes retreat impossible for those still in the lagoon. The day arrives. The assault begins with conventional attack on the main gate rams battering the wood and metal, scaling ladders going up the walls, soldiers attempting to force entry through the obvious approach that defenders expect and have prepared for. The attack is genuine, is not merely feint but is real attempt that might succeed if defenders are weak or if fortune favors the attackers, but is also serving broader purpose of drawing defenders to that section of wall, of concentrating Carthaginian forces where they can see the obvious threat while missing the less obvious danger developing elsewhere. The garrison responds as predicted, masses at the threatened section, fights fiercely to hold the gate and to push down the ladders and to prevent breakthrough that would allow Romans into the city. While the battle rages at the gate, while defenders focus on holding that position, while the obvious assault absorbs their attention and their strength, Scipio sends his picked troops across the lagoon. The water is shallow, as the fishermen said, reaches waist-deep at most, allows men to wade across carrying shields above their heads to keep them dry, carrying weapons ready for use when they reach the far side, moving in formation that maintains cohesion despite the water, that keeps units together rather than dissolving into mob of individuals struggling through unfamiliar terrain. The crossing succeeds no drowning, no getting stuck, no ambushes from defenders who are not present because the defenders assumed no attack could come from this direction, assumed the lagoon was barrier rather than recognizing it was vulnerability. The troops reach the northern wall, find it lightly defended or undefended, scale it using ladders they carried across the lagoon, reach the top without significant resistance, establish foothold on the walls, begin working their way toward the gate from inside while defenders are still focused on holding the gate from outside. The defenders realize too late that they have been flanked, that enemy is already inside their defenses, that the attack they were resisting was preparation for the attack they did not anticipate. A panic spreads. Some defenders try to disengage from the gate to rush to the new breach. Others maintain their positions because abandoning them might allow breakthrough at the gate. The coordination dissolves into confusion as command structure struggles to respond to situation that training and planning had not prepared them for. Scipio's troops reach the gate from inside, open it from within, allow the main assault force to pour through, create the two-pronged attack that overwhelms defenders who cannot hold against enemies attacking from front and rear simultaneously. The city falls in hours rather than months, falls in single day through combination of intelligence and timing and tactical innovation that exploited the blind spot that conventional defensive wisdom created, that turned defenders' confidence in their fortifications into vulnerability that careful attacker could exploit. The garrison surrenders. The city is taken. The supplies are captured intact, the hostages are freed, the wealth that funded Carthaginian operations is now in Roman hands. The naval base that supported supply runs to Italy is now denied to Carthage and available to Rome. The symbol and substance of Carthaginian power in Spain is shattered in single brilliant stroke that accomplishes in one day what conventional siege might have taken months to achieve and might have failed to achieve at all. The victory is complete, is devastating to Carthaginian position in Spain, is demonstration that Scipio is not merely brave young officer, but is tactical genius capable of seeing opportunities that others miss, capable of executing complex operations that require coordination and timing and the ability to adapt when circumstances shift, capable of commanding at the highest level despite his youth and despite his lack of traditional qualifications. The propaganda value equals the military value. Rome has won a major victory, has proven that Carthage can be beaten, has shown that the war is not lost despite Hannibal's continued presence in Italy, has given hope to allies and subjects who had begun to doubt whether Rome could survive. Scipio's reputation soars. The young commander who accomplished what his father and uncle could not, who took the impregnable city, who demonstrated tactical brilliance that suggests he might be the commander who can finally match Hannibal, who can learn from the Carthaginian master and can defeat him using methods that combine Roman discipline with innovative tactics that violate orthodox, but achieve results that orthodoxy cannot. We stand at New Carthage after the assault, among the ruins of Carthaginian confidence, among the evidence that careful preparation and tactical innovation can overcome defensive positions that seem unassailable, that the impossible can be achieved if the attempt is planned carefully enough and executed boldly enough and timed precisely enough. The city stands, the walls are intact, the buildings are undamaged by the quick assault, the infrastructure is captured rather than destroyed, the value is preserved rather than being lost to the destructive siege warfare that turns objectives into ruins even when objectives are achieved. The victory is clean, is accomplished, is complete. And Scipio has proven himself not through rhetoric or through connections but through results, through taking the city that could not be taken, through accomplishing in one day what conventional wisdom said required months or years or could not be done at all. The city taken by tide and will, the assault that became legend. The victory that announced that Rome had found its general, that Scipio Africanus was becoming the name that would be carved in history, that the young man was becoming the legend. Among the prisoners at New Carthage are hundreds of Spanish hostages, children and relatives of tribal leaders held by Carthage to ensure their parents' and families' cooperation with Carthaginian authority, kept as human insurance policy against rebellion, fed and housed adequately because starving or mistreating them would defeat their purpose, but reminded daily through their captivity that their family's freedom depends on their continued submission to Carthaginian demands. That resistance would be punished through harming those held hostage, that cooperation is not voluntary, but is coerced through the most effective leverage that any authority can possess control over the lives of those that the leaders love. The practice is ancient, is standard method of imperial control, is how empires manage conquered territories without maintaining garrisons in every town and village, without the expense of permanent military occupation, without the constant threat of force that breeds resentment and that requires resources that most empires cannot indefinitely sustain. They take hostages from the ruling families, keep them in the capital or in regional centers, treat them well enough that they are valuable, remind their families that the hostages' continued well-being depends on cooperation, and you have created system where the conquered enforce their own submission, where rebellion becomes unthinkable because it endangers those the rebels love most. Where resistance dies before it begins because the cost of resistance is measured in the lives of sons and daughters and siblings held far away where local power cannot protect them. Carthage has employed this system effectively, has maintained control over Iberian tribes through network of hostages held at New Carthage and other centers, has suppressed rebellion through implicit and occasionally explicit threats against hostages whose families step out of line, has created structure where tribal leaders police their own people to prevent actions that might endanger their captive relatives. The system is efficient, is relatively inexpensive compared to permanent military occupation, is sustainable over long periods because it requires only maintaining the hostage facilities and making occasional examples of those whose families rebel despite the threats. Scipio inherits these hostages when he takes New Carthage, inherits the system and the implicit bargain that the hostages represent, inherits the power to continue Carthaginian practice, and to use the hostages as Rome has every practical reason to use them to secure the tribal leaders' cooperation with Roman authority, to ensure that the transition from Carthaginian to Roman control proceeds smoothly. To maintain the structure that works rather than dismantling it in pursuit of abstract principle that might sound noble, but that would sacrifice practical advantage that hostages provide. The Senate would likely approve such use, would understand that empires run on pragmatism rather than idealism, that maintaining control over newly conquered territories requires using whatever tools are available, that freeing hostages without securing anything in return is foolish generosity that weakens rather than strengthens Roman position. But Scipio orders the hostages freed immediately. He orders them released without conditions, without ransom, without demands for their families' future cooperation. Orders gifts given to them, clothing and supplies for their journey home, money sufficient for their needs, treatment that transforms them from prisoners into honored guests. Orders messages sent with them to their families and tribes, messages proclaiming Roman friendship and Roman respect for Spanish autonomy, messages explaining that Rome seeks allies rather than subjects, partners rather than conquered peoples, relationships based on mutual benefit and respect rather than on coercion and fear. The gesture is politically brilliant, is masterstroke of psychological warfare that transforms Carthage's hostages into Rome's ambassadors, that turns coercion into gratitude, that demonstrates through action rather than words that Roman power offers liberation where Carthaginian power demanded submission, that Rome treats even former enemies with honor and generosity that wins loyalty more effectively than force can compel obedience. The freed hostages return home as living proof that Rome is different from Carthage, that Roman promises can be trusted, that cooperation with Rome brings benefits rather than merely avoiding punishments, that Spanish tribes have choice between empire that rules through fear and empire that rules through alliance. But the gesture is also risky, is gambling that gratitude will translate into political loyalty, that the freed hostages and their families will choose to support Rome rather than remaining neutral or even continuing to support Carthage, that generosity will be understood as strength rather than as weakness that can be exploited, that the immediate cost of losing the leverage that hostages provided will be compensated by the long-term gain of willing allies rather than sullen subjects. The gamble could fail. The tribal leaders could take Roman gifts and then maintain neutrality, could accept liberation and then support Carthage anyway out of fear or calculation or simple preference for the familiar over the unknown, could see Scipio's mercy as invitation to exploit Roman naivete rather than as basis for genuine alliance. The gamble succeeds. The Spanish tribes begin switching sides, begin withdrawing support from Carthage and providing it to Rome, begin offering intelligence about Carthaginian movements and supply routes, begin denying resources to Carthaginian armies and providing them to Roman forces, begin actively assisting Roman operations in ways that shift the military balance and that make Roman conquest of Spain not just possible but probable. Not just achievable through Roman military superiority, but achievable through combination of Roman arms and Spanish support that together overwhelm Carthaginian forces that are now isolated, cut off from local assistance, operating in hostile rather than friendly territory. The transformation reveals something about power and how it operates most effectively, about coercion and persuasion, about fear and loyalty, about the difference between subjects who obey because they must and allies who cooperate because they choose to, about imperial strategy that recognizes that the most sustainable conquests are those where the conquered come to see their conquerors as liberators, or at least as preferable alternative to previous rulers. Where the change in sovereignty brings improvements rather than merely substituting one master for another, where empire offers something beyond the mere fact of conquest, offers security or prosperity or justice or autonomy, or some combination of benefits that make submission feel less like submission and more like voluntary participation in common enterprise. We trace the transformation from coercion to cooperation, from fear-based compliance to willing alliance, from empire maintained through hostages to commonwealth maintained through mutual benefit and respect. Watch as the freed hostages make their way home along Spanish roads, carrying gifts and messages, transformed from prisoners into diplomats, from leverage into ambassadors, from symbols of Carthaginian power into evidence of Roman magnanimity. Watch as the messages reach tribal councils, as fathers embrace sons they thought lost, as families reunite because Roman commander chose generosity over pragmatism, chose building loyalty through kindness rather than maintaining control through threats, chose the harder path that requires risking immediate advantage in pursuit of long-term alliance. The tribes respond. Not all immediately, not all enthusiastically, not all without calculation of which side is likely to win and which side it is prudent to support. But enough respond, enough switch their allegiance or begin providing assistance, enough are won over by the treatment of the hostages that the balance shifts, that Carthaginian control over Spain begins to crumble not merely under Roman military pressure, but under the defection of allies who decide that Rome offers better terms than Carthage demanded, that liberation is worth supporting even when liberation means accepting new master. That the devil you don't know might actually be better than the devil you do know if the unknown devil makes credible promises and backs them with actions that suggest the promises are genuine. Scipio's decision to free the hostages becomes case study in strategic thinking that looks beyond immediate tactical advantage, that understands that winning battles is insufficient if you cannot win the loyalty of populations who must choose between competing empires, that the most effective conquests are those where the conquered become willing participants in the enterprise rather than remaining resistant subjects who will rebel whenever opportunity arises. The freed hostages who became ambassadors carry message that will echo across the ancient world, that will be remembered when Carthaginian coercion is forgotten, that will demonstrate that sometimes generosity is stronger than fear, that sometimes releasing your leverage is more effective than using it, that sometimes the way to win wars is not through being more ruthless than your enemy, but through being more just. The lesson will serve Rome well in the centuries ahead, will inform the policies that allow Rome to build and maintain empire larger than any before it, will create the Pax Romana that brings unprecedented peace and prosperity to Mediterranean world, not merely through Roman military might but through Roman willingness to incorporate conquered peoples into the system. to offer them paths to citizenship and participation. And to make empire something that provinces learn to value rather than something they merely submit to because they have no choice. The hostages who became ambassadors, the children freed rather than exploited, the leverage released rather than applied. The moment when Scipio demonstrated that he was not merely brilliant tactician, but was strategic thinker who understood that wars are won not just on battlefields but in the hearts and minds of those who must decide which side to support, which empire to accept, which future to embrace. The gesture that changed Spain, the mercy that was stronger than coercion, the generosity that won what force alone could not have won. At Ilipa in 206 BCE, on a plain southwest of modern Seville where olive groves now grow, and where tourists pass without knowing that armies once clashed in struggles that determined empires' fates, Scipio faces the largest Carthaginian army remaining in Spain. Hasdrubal Gisco commands not Hannibal's brother but another Carthaginian general, experienced and competent, leading forces that outnumber Roman legions, occupying strong defensive position on rising ground where his army can deploy with advantage, where Roman assault would be costly, where waiting for Scipio to attack seems like sound strategy that will bleed Roman forces even if Romans eventually prevail through superior numbers or determination. The Carthaginian army is impressive war elephants on the flanks, Carthaginian heavy infantry in the center, Spanish and Numidian allies filling out the wings, cavalry screening the approaches, defensive position that makes frontal assault unappealing, and that suggests Carthaginian commanders expect to fight the kind of set-piece battle that their armies have won repeatedly against Roman orthodoxy, that they have studied Roman tactics and have positioned themselves to exploit Roman tendencies, that they expect predictable deployment where Romans put their best troops in the center and their allies on the wings, where the battle becomes grinding match in the center while wings play supporting role, where Carthaginian experience and position should give them advantage even against competent opponent. But Scipio has been studying Hannibal, has learned from the master, has understood that Roman strength, the heavy infantry in the center, the grinding forward pressure that crushes enemies through discipline and endurance can be turned into weakness if the flanks collapse. That Canna worked not because Hannibal's center defeated the Roman center, but because Hannibal's wings destroyed the Roman wings and then enveloped the Roman center. That winning the battle's edges is winning the battle regardless of what happens in the middle, that the ancient military wisdom that battles are won in the center is false when facing commander who understands how to use cavalry and how to coordinate wings and center into integrated operation where each element supports the others. Scipio reverses the standard Roman deployment, puts his best troops, the veteran Roman legionaries, on the wings instead of in the center. Puts his Spanish allies in the center where Romans usually fight, where the grinding match will occur, where the numerical advantage matters less than at the wings where maneuver and skill determine outcomes. The deployment violates Roman military tradition, confuses observers who expect conventional arrangement, creates situation where if the plan fails, the failure will be comprehensive because the best troops are positioned where they can be surrounded and destroyed if the wings collapse, where unconventional deployment means unconventional vulnerability if Carthaginians respond effectively. But the deployment also creates opportunity. Roman legionaries on the wings will face Spanish and Numidian troops rather than Carthaginian heavy infantry, will have advantage in training and equipment and discipline that should allow them to defeat the flanking units quickly, will be positioned to envelop the Carthaginian center once the wings are secured, will enable Scipio to execute the double envelopment that Hannibal perfected at Cannae, turning Carthaginian tactics against Carthaginian forces. Proving that lessons learned in defeat can be applied to achieve victory when student faces teacher's pupils, when the education paid for in Roman blood at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae can be used to defeat Carthaginian armies in Spain. The battle begins at dawn after days of preliminary maneuvering where Scipio has brought his troops out early each day, has deployed them in different formations, has kept Carthaginian commanders uncertain about Roman intentions, has created pattern of morning deployments that become routine, that make Carthaginians expect that today will be like previous days, that nothing decisive will happen, that the armies will face each other and maneuver and withdraw without major engagement. But today is different. Today Scipio advances his wings before the center moves, attacks the Carthaginian flanks before they are fully prepared, catches them off balance because they expected conventional deployment and conventional timing, and are not positioned to resist the attack that actually comes. The Roman wings crash into Carthaginian flanks with the weight of veteran legionaries behind them, with the discipline that makes Roman infantry formidable even against superior numbers, with the training that allows complex maneuvers in combat that irregular troops cannot execute, with the determination that comes from knowing that this battle can end the war in Spain, that victory here means Carthage loses Iberia. That winning today means going home rather than continuing to campaign in foreign land far from families and familiar places. The Carthaginian flanks resist but are overmatched. The Spanish and Numidian troops fight bravely but cannot match the Roman legionaries' discipline and armor and tactics, begin to give ground, begin to break as casualties mount, and as realization spreads that they are losing, that the wings are collapsing, that retreat is necessary to avoid being surrounded and slaughtered. The Carthaginian center holds the heavy infantry there, is as good as any in the ancient world, is experienced and determined and positioned on favorable ground, is grinding forward against the Spanish allies in the Roman center, is achieving local success even as the flanks fail. Is demonstrating that Carthaginian infantry can match anyone when they fight on their terms and when they have position, and when their opponents are not the veteran Roman legionaries, but are the allied troops who lack the training and equipment and cohesion that make Romans so formidable. But the center's success is temporary, is tactical victory that leads to strategic catastrophe, because winning in the center means nothing if the wings have been destroyed and the army has been enveloped. Scipio's wings complete their destruction of the Carthaginian flanks, wheel inward, begin the envelopment that will trap the Carthaginian center between converging forces, that will create the same tactical situation that Hannibal created at Cannae, but with roles reversed, with Romans executing the double envelopment and Carthaginians being encircled, with the lesson learned at cost of 70,000 Roman lives being applied to destroy the Carthaginian army in Spain. With the education paid for in blood and defeat being used to achieve victory and revenge, with Scipio demonstrating that he has learned from Hannibal and has surpassed the master by applying Carthaginian methods with Roman modifications that make them even more effective. The Carthaginian center realizes too late that it is surrounded, that the advance has become trap, that the local success has isolated them from supports that no longer exist, that retreat is now impossible because enemies are behind them as well as in front, that the battle is lost, and that the only question is whether they can break through the encirclement or whether they will be destroyed where they stand. Some units attempt to break out, fighting desperately to create gaps they can escape through, losing cohesion as discipline dissolves into individual survival instinct, becoming mob rather than army as the realization of disaster spreads, and as hope of organized victory gives way to desperate hope of personal survival. The slaughter is comprehensive. Hasdrubal Gisco escapes with perhaps 1,000 cavalry, flees the field, leaves his army to be destroyed, saves himself but cannot save the Carthaginian position in Spain, carries news of disaster back to Carthage, reports that Spain is lost, that Roman general named Scipio has defeated the largest remaining Carthaginian army in Iberia, that the supply base that sustained Hannibal's war in Italy has been cut. That Carthage must either send massive reinforcements to Spain to contest Roman control, or must accept that Iberia is gone, and that Carthage's empire has been reduced by entire province that provided silver and soldiers and supplies. The victory is crushing, is comprehensive, is demonstration that Scipio has learned everything Hannibal could teach, and has added innovations that make him dangerous opponent for any Carthaginian commander. That Rome has finally found general who can think strategically and tactically at the highest level, who can match the Carthaginians best, and can defeat them using methods that combine Roman strengths with tactical flexibility that previous Roman commanders lacked. Who represents new type of Roman commander who learns from enemies and adapts and overcomes through intelligence and innovation rather than merely through discipline and endurance and the grinding pressure that characterized traditional Roman warfare. The strategic implications cascade through the Mediterranean world. Hannibal in Italy receives news that his supply base is cut, that reinforcements he expected will not arrive, that Spain is lost and that his position in Italy is now precarious, that Rome has found commander who can contest Carthage at the highest level, that the war is no longer one-sided in Carthage's favor but has become genuine contest where victory is no longer assured to either side. Where continued fighting might lead to Roman victory rather than to the Carthaginian triumph that seemed inevitable after Cannae, that the tide has turned, and that the initiative has shifted from Carthage to Rome. The Senate receives news with relief that borders on disbelief after years of disasters, after Trebia and Trasimene and Canna, after the seemingly endless string of defeats and the constant fear that Hannibal would march on Rome itself, after the desperation that made them give command to untested young noble because they had no better options. Rome has won major victory, has expelled Carthage from Spain, has demonstrated that Roman armies can win when properly led. That Scipio was not fool or reckless gambler but was precisely what Rome needed, was commander who could learn and adapt and overcome, was general who could match Hannibal and who might the thought is barely thinkable but begins to be thought, who might even be able to defeat Hannibal himself if they ever face each other in direct confrontation. We stand on the plain at Ilipa after the battle, among the evidence of Roman victory and Carthaginian catastrophe, among the dead who lie scattered where they fell, among the abandoned weapons and equipment that testify to the completeness of defeat, among the silence that follows battles when the screaming stops and the dying finish dying and the survivors withdraw, and only the carrion birds remain to claim the feast that war provides. The cavalry that won the wings, the envelopment that destroyed the center, the tactical brilliance that transformed theoretical understanding of how Hannibal won into practical application that defeated Carthaginian army, all visible in the aftermath, all written in the positions of the dead and in the evidence of how the battle flowed, all demonstrating that Scipio has become what Rome desperately needed, a general who can win. The battle where cavalry became destiny, the wings that destroyed the center. Oh, the envelopment that avenged Canna. The victory that announced that Rome was no longer merely surviving but was beginning to win, that Carthage's dominance was ending, that the long nightmare that began with Hannibal's Alpine crossing was approaching its conclusion, that Scipio Africanus, though he does not yet bear that cognomen, has not yet defeated Carthage in Africa, has not yet earned the title that will define his legacy, is becoming the savior that Rome needs, the general who will defeat Hannibal and save the Republic from annihilation. The plain remembers, the tactics endure, the lesson is learned and applied and proven in blood and victory. Ilipa, where cavalry became destiny, where wings determined outcomes, where Scipio proved he had learned from Hannibal and could defeat Carthaginians using methods their own master had perfected. Scipio proposes the unthinkable. After expelling Carthage from Spain, after demonstrating tactical brilliance at Ilipa, after proving himself as commander who can win battles and campaigns and who can administer conquered territories with combination of firmness and generosity that maintains order while winning loyalty, after all this, Scipio proposes that Rome should invade Africa, should attack Carthage in its homeland. It should take the war to the enemy rather than continuing to fight defensively in Italy, where Hannibal still operates with diminished forces but with his tactical genius intact, where Roman armies still died despite improvements in Roman generalship, where the war grinds on without clear path to conclusion that does not involve simply waiting for Hannibal to exhaust himself or for Carthage to lose interest or for some external factor to force Carthaginian withdrawal. The proposal is strategic insight combined with audacity recognizes that Hannibal will never voluntarily leave Italy, that his presence there serves Carthaginian interests even if he cannot force Rome to surrender, that as long as he remains in Italy Rome must maintain armies to contain him, must divert resources to defense that could be used elsewhere, must accept the continued threat and the constant possibility that one more catastrophic defeat would break Roman will where previous defeats have not. But if Carthage itself is threatened, if Carthaginian territory is invaded, if the home city faces siege or destruction, then Carthage must either defend itself or risk losing everything, must recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland, must choose between maintaining offensive in Italy and defending against Roman offensive in Africa. The Senate resists the proposal with arguments that are reasonable and that reflect both practical concerns and political considerations. The plan is risky, requires shipping army to Africa, requires operating in hostile territory far from Roman bases, requires maintaining supply lines across sea that Carthaginian navy might interdict, requires fighting Carthaginian armies on their home ground where they have advantages of local knowledge and local support and short supply lines. The plan is expensive, requires gathering transport ships, requires recruiting or assigning legions for the invasion force, requires diverting resources from Italy where they are needed to contain Hannibal, requires gambling that the invasion will succeed quickly enough that Rome is not left vulnerable in Italy while forces are committed to Africa. The plan is also politically threatening, concentrates enormous power in Scipio's hands, makes him independent commander of major military operation far from senatorial oversight, creates conditions where he could win glory and loyalty from his soldiers that might translate into political power that threatens senatorial authority, makes him into the kind of figure that republics fear. The successful general whose soldiers are loyal to him personally rather than to the state, whose victories make him popular with common people who care less about constitutional proprieties than about winning the war, whose achievements make him difficult to control through normal political mechanisms that work when politicians can threaten each other, but that fail when one politician has military power and popular support that exceeds what collective Senate can muster. But Rome is also desperate in different way than it was after Cannae, then desperate for survival, now desperate for victory, then desperate to avoid defeat, now desperate to end war that has consumed Italy for over a decade, that has killed hundreds of thousands, that has devastated the countryside and impoverished the treasury and exhausted the population, that continues without clear endpoint unless something changes. Unless some new strategy breaks the stalemate that Hannibal's continued presence in Italy represents, even though his army is weakened, and his chances of ultimate victory are diminished. The Senate debates with intensity that reflects both the stakes and the political divisions, with Scipio's supporters arguing that his plan is bold but achievable, that his record in Spain proves he can execute complex operations, that invading Africa offers realistic path to victory where continuing current strategy offers only continuation of status quo that everyone is exhausted by. His opponents argue that the risk is too great, that Scipio is too young and too ambitious, that concentrating so much power in one person's hands threatens republican governance, that failure would be catastrophic and would leave Rome vulnerable, that even success might create political problems if victorious general returns with loyal army and popular acclaim and ambitions that exceed what republic can safely accommodate. The compromise is typical of senatorial politics, gives Scipio permission to prepare for invasion, but does not give him official approval or the resources he requested, allows him to go to Sicily where he can gather forces and where he might cross to Africa if circumstances permit, makes the invasion provisional rather than official, so that if it fails the Senate can claim they never fully approved it, and if it succeeds they can claim credit for supporting it. He maintains plausible deniability while allowing Scipio to attempt what they will not officially endorse. The permission is minimal but sufficient. Scipio accepts what he can get, understands that arguing for more would achieve nothing except alienating senators he needs to support him, takes what is offered and commits to making it work despite limitations. Sicily becomes staging ground where contradictions of Roman politics become visible. Scipio needs army but Senate will not assign him veterans. Needs ships but must gather them himself. Needs supplies but must arrange his own logistics. Must build invasion force from volunteers and misfits, and whatever resources he can scrape together through personal networks, and through reputation that attracts those willing to follow him even without official sanction. Even without the legitimacy that senatorial approval would provide, even knowing that they are embarking on operation that might fail catastrophically, and that Senate might disavow if failure comes and claim credit for if success arrives. The volunteers come, some attracted by Scipio's reputation earned in Spain, some seeking glory or plunder or adventure, some simply wanting to fight under commander who wins rather than under commanders who lose, some motivated by calculation that following Scipio offers better prospects than remaining in Italy under other commanders, some believing in the invasion's strategic logic and wanting to be part of operation that might end the war. The army that gathers is not Rome's finest. The veterans are needed in Italy. The bestequiped legions are deployed elsewhere. What Scipio gets is second-tier force that requires training and organization and time to transform from collection of volunteers into effective army capable of conquering Carthage. The Allies provide crucial support. Massinissa, Numidian prince who defected from Carthage to Rome, who brings cavalry expertise and local knowledge and connections among North African tribes, who will prove essential to Roman victory in Africa, who represents the kind of alliance that Scipio cultivates through personal relationships and through demonstration that Rome rewards its friends, who shows that Scipio understands that wars are won through combinations of military force and political alliance. Through fighting battles and through winning hearts and minds of potential supporters, who must choose between competing sides. The crossing happens not with fanfare of officially sanctioned invasion, but with quiet determination of commander who has been given minimal permission and who makes maximum use of it, who gathers what ships he can, who loads his volunteer army, who sails to Africa not with certainty of senatorial support but with confidence in his own abilities and in his soldiers' loyalty, and in the strategic logic that says threatening Carthage is the way to remove Hannibal from Italy. That offense is better than defense when defense merely prolongs stalemate without creating conditions for victory. The fleet crosses the Mediterranean carrying not just soldiers but carrying Rome's hopes and Scipio's ambitions and the possibility that this gamble will work, that Africa can be invaded, that Carthage can be threatened or conquered, that Hannibal can be forced to leave Italy to defend his home city, that the war can be won through audacity where caution has only prolonged suffering. That everything can change because one commander saw what needed to be done and found way to do it despite political obstacles and resource limitations, and all the reasons why the attempt should fail. We watch the ships disappear over the horizon, watch the sails fade into distance, imagine the soldiers aboard wondering what awaits them in Africa, wondering if they will return from this invasion or if their bones will join those of countless others who invaded foreign lands and never came home, wondering if Scipio's confidence is warranted or if they are sailing toward disaster that will add their names to history's list of failed invasions and doomed armies, wondering but going nonetheless because they have committed. Because the ships have sailed, because the only way forward is across the water toward uncertain shore where Carthage waits. The crossing that changed everything, the invasion that Senate barely approved, the gamble that Scipio made with army of volunteers and minimal support, with strategic insight that saw what others missed, with audacity that attempted what others thought impossible, with determination that transformed minimal permission into maximum achievement. The ships sail, the coast recedes, Africa approaches. And the war enters its final phase, the phase where everything will be decided, where either Rome wins or Carthage wins, where stalemate ends and victory or defeat becomes inevitable, where Scipio's reputation will be confirmed or destroyed, where Roman history will turn on the success or failure of invasion that should not have happened, that was barely authorized, that succeeded despite having every reason to fail. The crossing, the commitment. The point of no return where retreat becomes impossible and only forward remains possible, and forward leads to either triumph or catastrophe with nothing in between. The armies face each other on African plain west of Carthage, on ground that will become sacred to military historians, on field where the Second Punic War's outcome will be determined, where 16 years of warfare will culminate in single battle's verdict, where two of history's greatest commanders will face each other in direct confrontation after years of fighting in separate theaters, where master and student will test each other, and where the student must prove that he has learned everything the master could teach, and has added innovations that make him equal or superior. Scipio commands Roman and Numidian forces totaling perhaps 35,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, not the largest army Rome has fielded during this war. Not approaching the 80,000 that died at Cannae, but professional force composed of veterans who have campaigned with Scipio in Spain and Africa, who have learned his methods and trust his judgment, who have won battles under his command, and who believe that he can defeat Hannibal despite Hannibal's legendary reputation. Who are Roman legionaries at their best combined with Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, who provide the mobile striking force that will prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Hannibal commands Carthaginian army hastily assembled after his recall from Italy, combination of his veterans who spent 15 years campaigning in Italy and who are among the most experienced soldiers in the ancient world, Carthaginian recruits who lack the veterans' experience but who are fighting for their home city, and the 80 war elephants that Carthage has gathered as strike force that will break Roman lines and create the chaos that allows Carthaginian cavalry and infantry to complete the destruction. The elephants that represent both Carthage's desperation and its hope, its attempt to use massive force to overcome Roman discipline, its gamble that shock and terror can accomplish what tactics might not. The two commanders meet before the battle. Sources report a parley where Hannibal and Scipio speak face to face, where master and student confront each other not as enemies, but as men who respect each other's abilities, and who understand that tomorrow one will triumph and one will fail, but that both are trapped in circumstances where personal preference matters less than political necessity, where they must fight because their cities demand it, even though both might prefer peace that neither can deliver without appearing weak or disloyal or incapable of defending their nation's interests. The conversation, if it happened, sources disagree, and later Roman historians may have invented it to provide dramatic moment before climactic battle reveals Hannibal's recognition that victory is no longer certain, that Carthage's position is desperate, that continued warfare might bring total destruction where negotiated peace might preserve something. He proposes terms: Carthage keeps Africa, Rome keeps Spain and Italy. The war ends with both powers having gained and lost, with neither achieving total victory but both avoiding total defeat, with compromise that might be basis for lasting peace between two exhausted powers who have discovered that neither can completely destroy the other. Scipio refuses. The terms Hannibal offers are terms that Rome might have accepted after Cannae, when survival was uncertain and any peace seemed preferable to continued catastrophe. But Rome has survived, has expelled Carthage from Spain, has invaded Africa, has demonstrated that Carthage can be beaten, has given Scipio the mandate to end the war through victory rather than through compromise that leaves Carthage strong enough to threaten Rome again in future. The refusal is both personal and political. Scipio must win rather than negotiate because negotiation would be seen as weakness, because the opportunity to defeat Hannibal is too valuable to sacrifice for compromise, because Rome wants victory not accommodation, wants Carthage humbled not merely balanced, wants peace secured through Carthaginian defeat rather than through treaty between equals. The battle begins at dawn. Hannibal deploys his elephants in front of his army, 80 massive beasts that will charge into Roman lines and break them through terror and trampling, that will create the chaos that allows infantry and cavalry to exploit the gaps, that represent desperate gamble that massive frontal assault can overwhelm Roman discipline before Romans can respond effectively. The elephants are Carthage's shock troops, its attempt to break Roman formations before the grinding infantry battle begins, its hope that psychological effect of charging elephants combined with physical damage they inflict will be sufficient to create the conditions for Carthaginian tactical superiority to determine the battle's outcome. Scipio counters with tactical innovation that turns Carthaginian strength into weakness. He creates lanes through his formation, gaps between the maniples that allow elephants to charge through Roman lines without contacting the legionaries, that funnel the beasts harmlessly to the rear where they can be killed or driven off without disrupting Roman cohesion, that render useless the shock force that Carthage has concentrated as its main weapon. The innovation requires discipline, requires soldiers to maintain formation while elephants charge toward them, requires them to resist the natural instinct to close ranks or to flee, requires them to trust that Scipio's plan will work and that the lanes will protect them from the terror bearing down on them. The elephants charge, trumpeting their rage and fear, driven forward by mahouts who control them and by the momentum of their own charge. Massive bodies moving faster than such size suggests possible tusks and feet and bulk that can crush men and break formations, that represent primal terror that humans feel facing large predators or dangerous animals, that should create panic that breaks armies before contact even occurs. But the legionaries hold, maintain the lanes, create the channels that funnel the elephants through the Roman formation without allowing them to strike, that allow the beasts to run through the lines like water through sieve, that neutralize them without requiring Romans to fight them directly, that prove Scipio has understood that the obvious counter to massive frontal assault is not resistance but channeling, is creating space where threat can dissipate. It is using enemies' momentum against them by providing path of least resistance that leads away from where damage can be done. The elephants emerge behind Roman lines having accomplished nothing except confirming Scipio's tactical genius, having demonstrated that Carthaginian main weapon has been negated, having created psychological boost for Romans who have survived the elephant charge and who now face Carthaginian infantry with confidence that their commander knows what he is doing, that his plans work, that following his orders leads to victory rather than to disaster. Some elephants panic and turn back through Carthaginian lines, creating disorder in Carthaginian formation, disrupting units that were positioned to follow up the elephant charge, but that now must deal with maddened beasts charging back toward them, that suffer casualties from their own weapons before the battle even properly begins. The infantry battle follows Romans advancing in their characteristic formation, shields overlapping, spears creating wall of points that enemy must penetrate, grinding forward with discipline that makes them formidable even against superior numbers or superior position. Pressing Carthaginian infantry that fights bravely but that lacks the cohesion that Roman training provides, that is mixture of veterans and recruits rather than uniform force. That begins to give ground under pressure that does not relent, that does not break but that slowly retreats, that trades space for time and hopes that cavalry will break through on the wings and will save the center by enveloping the Romans as happened at Cannae. But the cavalry battle goes differently than Carthage planned. Massinissa's Numidians fight their Carthaginian counterparts, fight with fury of civil war, fight with knowledge of terrain and tactics that equals what Carthaginian cavalry possesses, fight with determination to prove that they made right choice in defecting to Rome, that Scipio is commander worth following, that Rome is power worth supporting. The cavalry clash is indecisive initially, both sides matched in skill and determination, neither achieving clear advantage, the battle on the wings balanced while center grinds on. Then Scipio's cavalry achieves breakthrough, defeats the Carthaginian horsemen, pursues them off the field, completes the rout that removes Carthaginian cavalry from the battle, leaves Hannibal's infantry without the mobile force that should protect their flanks and that should create the conditions for tactical victory. The Roman cavalry, instead of pursuing defeated Carthaginians indefinitely and thereby removing themselves from the battle as cavalry often did when they achieved breakthrough, maintains discipline, halts the pursuit, reorganizes, and returns to the battlefield where the infantry battle continues, where the outcome is still uncertain, where their arrival will determine victory or defeat. The returning cavalry hits Hannibal's infantry from behind, creates the double envelopment that Hannibal perfected at Cannae but that now destroys Carthaginian rather than Roman army. That completes the reversal where student defeats teacher using methods the teacher invented. That proves Scipio has learned everything Hannibal could teach and has applied those lessons with Roman discipline and coordination that makes them even more effective. The Carthaginian infantry is trapped between advancing Roman legionaries in front and attacking cavalry behind, is surrounded with no escape route, is being systematically destroyed by enemies attacking from all directions, is suffering the fate that Roman armies suffered at Cannae, but that now falls on Carthaginian forces. Hannibal attempts to rally his troops, attempts to create defensive formation that can resist long enough for some to escape, attempts to salvage something from disaster, but the collapse is too complete, the encirclement too thorough, the coordination between Roman cavalry and infantry too effective. The Carthaginian army is destroyed not completely. Some escape, including Hannibal himself, who leaves the field having done everything possible but having been outmaneuvered and outfought, having faced the one opponent who could match his tactical genius, and having discovered that on this day, on this field, genius was not sufficient when the opponent had learned from his example and had improved upon his methods. The casualties are enormous: 20,000 Carthaginians dead, thousands captured, the army that was Carthage's last hope for military victory shattered beyond recovery, the defeat so complete that Carthage must either surrender or face siege and destruction, must accept that the war is lost and that terms will be harsh, must acknowledge that Scipio Africanus he will receive that cognomen after this victory, will be honored as the conqueror of Carthage. And as the general who defeated Hannibal has achieved what seemed impossible after Cannae, has defeated the greatest tactical genius of the age and has won the war that Rome seemed destined to lose. We stand on the plain at Zama after the battle, among the evidence of Roman victory and Carthaginian catastrophe, among the dead who testify to the battle's fury and to its outcome, among the silence that follows when the violence stops and only aftermath remains. The elephants lie dead or dying, massive bodies that moved with such force hours ago now still forever, symbols of Carthaginian desperation and of Scipio's tactical innovation that rendered them irrelevant. The cavalry that won the wings and returned to destroy the center, the envelopment that avenged Cannae, the victory that ended the war and that made Scipio into legend, all visible in the aftermath, all written in how the armies deployed and fought and how one triumphed while other was destroyed. Zama. The plain where elephants died, the battle where cavalry became decisive, the engagement where master was defeated by student, the victory that saved Rome and that ended Carthage's bid for Mediterranean dominance, the triumph that made Scipio Africanus into Rome's savior and that made Hannibal into defeated legend whose genius was not sufficient against opponent who had learned from him and who had added innovations that made traditional Carthaginian tactics insufficient. The plain remembers. The tactics endure. The lesson is learned and proven that even the greatest can be defeated when facing student who has studied every victory and who has understood not just what the teacher did but why it worked and how it could be countered. Zama, where empire's fates were decided, where student defeated master, where Scipio became Africanus. Rome celebrates. The city that trembled after Cannae, that survived through stubborn refusal to surrender despite catastrophes, that endured 16 years of warfare and hundreds of thousands of casualties and devastation that left Italy impoverished, and exhausted. This city erupts in joy when news arrives that Scipio has defeated Hannibal at Zama, that Carthage has sued for peace, that the war that consumed a generation is finally over, that Rome has survived and has triumphed against enemy that seemed invincible, that the nightmare has ended and that the Republic will continue. The Senate decrees a triumph, the grandest Rome has ever seen, the procession through streets lined with citizens who owe Scipio everything, who know that without him Rome might have fallen, that Hannibal might have won, that their children might be growing up under Carthaginian rule or growing up dead because Carthage chose destruction over submission. The gratitude is genuine, is overwhelming, is the adulation that grateful nation gives to the man who saved it from annihilation, is recognition that individuals can matter, that one person's genius and courage and determination can change history, can save civilizations, can accomplish what collective institutions and traditional methods could not achieve. The triumph itself is spectacle designed to overwhelm begins at the Campus Martius outside the city walls, processes through the streets toward the capital, displays the spoils of victory and the prisoners of war and the evidence of conquest, presents the general who won the war to the people who benefited from his victories. Scipio rides in chariot pulled by white horses, wears purple toga embroidered with gold, carries ivory scepter crowned with eagle, is dressed and presented as closest thing to king that republic allows, is honored as conqueror and savior in ceremony that acknowledges individual achievement in system that is supposed to celebrate collective governance, and that is suspicious of individuals who become too successful or too popular or too powerful. Behind the chariot walks a slave whispering in Scipio's ear, "Remember you are mortal." Tradition requires this reminder, requires that even in moment of greatest triumph the general is reminded that glory is temporary, that no human is divine despite appearances, that pride comes before fall, that the adulation of crowds is fickle and that today's hero can become tomorrow's suspect. That Rome honors its saviors but also fears them, that gratitude and suspicion are not opposites but are complements. There are two aspects of how republics respond to exceptional individuals who demonstrate that sometimes one person matters more than institutions, that sometimes genius achieves what democratic processes cannot produce. The warning proves prophetic. The gratitude that seems pure and unconditional on Triumph Day curdles over months and years that follow, transforms into suspicion that combines genuine political concerns with personal jealousies and factional rivalries, and the Republican ideology that insists all citizens are equal and that fears anyone who becomes too unequal, who achieves too much, who demonstrates too clearly that individuals can be superior to their peers. That merit is real and that some people possess abilities that others lack, and that recognizing this reality threatens the comfortable fiction that all citizens are fundamentally equal, and that differences are merely circumstantial rather than essential. Cato leads the opposition Marcus Porcius Cato, called Cato the Elder to distinguish him from his great-grandson, representative of traditional Roman values and republican virtue, suspicious of Greek influence and of any innovation that threatens Roman customs, believer that Rome's strength comes from its traditions, and that abandoning those traditions brings corruption and weakness and eventual collapse. Cato sees Scipio as threat not just politically but culturally, sees him as representative of Hellenization that threatens Roman identity, as general who adopted Greek customs and Greek philosophy, and who surrounds himself with Greek intellectuals and artists, and who represents the kind of cosmopolitanism that traditional Romans fear as corrupting influence that will destroy the moral fiber that made Rome strong. The accusations begin quietly, are whispered in Senate corridors and in private conversations, are suggestions rather than formal charges, are insinuations that allow plausible deniability if challenged but that poison the political atmosphere and that create climate where Scipio's every action is viewed with suspicion, where his successes are reinterpreted as evidence of ambition rather than of service, where gratitude gives way to fear that he might use his popularity and his loyal veterans to seize power. And to make himself king or dictator, to overthrow the republic that he saved and to replace it with monarchy that republican ideology considers worse than death, considers betrayal of everything Rome stands for. The specific accusations are probably false or wildly exaggerated. Cato claims Scipio embezzled funds in Spain or Africa, kept for himself money that should have gone to Roman treasury, enriched himself through conquest that was supposed to enrich Rome. The evidence is thin or non-existent. The accounting practices of ancient warfare make exact verification impossible. The accusation functions more as political weapon than as genuine attempt to recover stolen funds or to punish actual corruption. But the accusation serves its purpose, creates doubt, suggests that Scipio is not the selfless hero, but is ambitious man who used public service to advance private interests, makes citizens wonder whether their savior is also their potential tyrant. Other accusations follow that Scipio governs like Greek king rather than like Roman magistrate, that he holds court like monarch, that he wears Greek clothing and studies Greek philosophy, and surrounds himself with Greeks who are not proper Romans, and who corrupt him with foreign ideas that threaten Roman virtue. That he is too lenient with defeated enemies, treats them with honor rather than with the harshness that defeats should receive, offers terms that benefit enemies at Rome's expense, demonstrates weakness that enemies interpret as invitation to rebel or resist or challenge Roman authority. That he creates personal loyalty among his soldiers rather than institutional loyalty to the state, makes them his men rather than Rome's men, builds personal power base that could be used against Republic if he chose to do so. The accusations accumulate despite lack of evidence, despite Scipio's actual record of service and success, despite the reality that without him Rome might have lost the war, and that criticizing the man who saved the Republic seems not just ungrateful but insane. But the accusations serve political purpose, remind everyone that no citizen should be above suspicion, that even saviors must be accountable, that republican virtue requires watching successful generals carefully lest they become tyrants, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance against those who might threaten it, especially when those potential threats are the very people who have previously defended that liberty. Scipio could fight back, could use his popularity to crush his opponents, could rally his veterans and could intimidate the Senate into silence, could demonstrate that accusations against him are false and politically motivated and should be dismissed. But fighting back would confirm his opponent's fears, would prove that he is threat to Republic, would create precedent where successful generals use military power to influence politics, would undermine the very system he fought to preserve, would make him into the tyrant that Cato claims he is regardless of whether he actually has tyrannical ambitions or whether he is simply defending himself against false accusations. The trap is perfect. Defend yourself aggressively and prove you are dangerous, accept accusations passively and appear guilty, Any response except complete submission to senatorial authority confirms that you are a threat to republican governance. Any assertion of personal dignity or accomplishment or merit is evidence of pride that threatens collective governance. Any suggestion that you deserve better treatment than you are receiving is aristocratic pretension that violates republican equality. Scipio is caught in logical bind where innocence cannot be proven, and where attempting to prove innocence becomes evidence of guilt. We trace the transformation from hero to suspect, from savior to threat, from the general whom Rome celebrated to the man whom Rome fears, from triumph to suspicion across months and years where political climate shifts, where gratitude fades, where the memory of Zama becomes less immediate, and where the fear of powerful individuals becomes more pressing. Where Rome's survival is no longer in question, and where the question becomes how to preserve republican governance against successful generals who might use their success to overthrow the system. The gratitude that became suspicion, the celebration that became investigation, the triumph that became accusation. The paradox at the heart of republican governance that it needs heroes during crisis but fears them during peace, that it must honor exceptional service but must also prevent exceptional individuals from becoming too powerful, that it must balance gratitude with vigilance, celebration with suspicion, recognition of merit with maintenance of equality, acknowledgement of individual achievement with preservation of collective governance. Scipio faces this paradox, becomes its victim, demonstrates that sometimes saving the republic means sacrificing yourself to the republic's fears, means accepting that even saviors can become threats in eyes of those they saved, means understanding that the price of fame is suspicion and that the reward for service is fear. Scipio withdraws from public life, retires to his estate at Liternum on the Campanian coast where sea breezes cool summer heat, and where winter storms remind that nature is more powerful than empires, where modest villa overlooks water that has witnessed civilizations rise and fall, and that will continue flowing regardless of human dramas played out along its shores. The withdrawal is not bitter retreat, not forced exile imposed by Senate or by political enemies who triumph through driving him from Rome, but is dignified choice, is recognition that his presence in the capital divides rather than unites, that his continued involvement in politics creates factions and tensions that threaten the stability he fought to preserve. That his service to Rome is complete and that remaining active serves no purpose, except to provide ammunition for those who fear him and problems for those who support him. The choice is both personal and political. Personal recognition that he is weary, that decades of warfare and command and political struggle have exhausted him, that he wants peace and quiet and time to contemplate life's meaning beyond military glory and political achievement, that the villa at Liternum offers what Rome cannot provide. Respite from suspicion, freedom from constant vigilance, opportunity to live as private citizen rather than as public figure whose every action is scrutinized, and whose every word is interpreted as potential threat or potential rebellion or potential challenge to senatorial authority. But the choice is also political calculation, understands that Rome needs him gone more than it needs him present, that his absence will reduce political tensions, that removing himself from capital will diffuse factional conflicts that center on his role and his power and his potential to threaten republican governance. That voluntary exile demonstrates that he is not tyrant in waiting but is citizen who puts state above self, who chooses Rome's peace over personal glory, who accepts that sometimes serving republic means accepting that republic cannot honor him without fearing him, cannot celebrate him without suspecting him, cannot acknowledge what he achieved without worrying about what he might attempt. The villa is modest by standards of Roman elite who typically build estates that proclaim wealth and status, who construct palaces that rival anything in Rome itself, who display their success through architecture that overwhelms and impresses and intimidates. Scipio's choice of modest villa is statement rejects ostentation, rejects displays of wealth that might suggest he profited excessively from his commands, rejects the lifestyle that would confirm Cato's accusations about Greek corruption and monarchical pretensions, demonstrates through architecture and lifestyle that he is content with simple dignity, that he does not need display or luxury or the trappings of power, that he has achieved enough and accumulated enough glory and has no need to prove anything to anyone. The location is significant. Liternum is far enough from Rome that Scipio is not obviously threatening, but is close enough that he could return quickly if crisis demanded it, is positioned where he can be forgotten by those who want to forget him but can be remembered by those who need to remember him, is exile that is also availability, is retreat that is also readiness, is withdrawal that maintains possibility of return if circumstances change, and if Rome again needs the general who saved it. The ambiguity is deliberate, is maintaining options while appearing to close them, is keeping possibility alive while seeming to abandon it. The years at Liternum are peaceful according to sources that mention them at all. Scipio spends time with family and friends, writes or dictates memoirs that do not survive, but that later historians claim to have consulted, receives visitors who seek his wisdom or company or who simply want to meet the famous general before he dies, lives quietly and without seeking attention or involvement in politics that continues in Rome without him. The silence is choice, is refusal to engage in factional struggles that would only draw him back into conflicts he chose to leave, is recognition that commenting on politics would only create problems because anything he says would be interpreted as criticism or support or intervention, would be used by one faction against another, would make him player in games he wants no part of. The tradition records that Scipio died at Liternum, was buried there according to his wishes, allegedly remarked, "Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones," refusing burial at Rome, refusing to return even in death to city that saved itself through his genius but that could not honor him without fearing him, that needed him desperately during crisis but that viewed him with suspicion during peace, that celebrated him with triumph, but that investigated him with accusations. That made him into legend, but that could not let him be human. That required him to be either perfect hero or potential tyrant, without allowing the middle ground where actual humans exist with virtues and flaws and complications that do not fit into ideological categories. The quote, "If Scipio actually said it," later historians may have invented it to encapsulate the tragedy, expresses the hurt that underlies the dignity, the wound that the dignified withdrawal attempts to conceal, the recognition that service is not always appreciated or rewarded or even acknowledged properly, that sometimes saving the nation means being suspected by the nation, that sometimes the reward for selfless service is exile imposed by those you served, that sometimes gratitude is temporary emotion that fades when immediate danger passes, and that is replaced by the eternal suspicion that republics feel toward anyone who demonstrates that individuals can be superior to institutions, that merit is real and that some citizens are more capable than others, and that acknowledging this reality threatens the comfortable ideology that all citizens are equal. The tomb at Liternum becomes shrine, or so tradition claims, though the tomb's actual location is disputed and may have been lost or destroyed, or may never have been as grand as later accounts suggest, may have been modest memorial that reflected Scipio's modest villa and modest lifestyle in retirement, may have been exactly what he wanted. A simple marker indicating that here rests the man who defeated Hannibal, without ostentation or grandeur or claims beyond the achievement itself, without need to impress or to convince or to demand recognition, because the achievement speaks for itself and requires no elaboration. We stand where the tomb was or might have been, listening to waves breaking on shore as they broke when Scipio walked this beach, contemplating career that brought glory and suspicion, triumph and exile, salvation and rejection, everything that ambitious Roman could want and everything that ambitious Roman could not accept: the fame without the honor, the recognition without the respect, the gratitude without the trust. The celebration followed by investigation, followed by voluntary exile that was preferable to remaining in capital where presence created problems that absence solved. The exile who chose silence, the general who saved Rome and whom Rome could not honor without fearing, the hero who became suspect, the savior who died far from the city he saved. The victor who chose withdrawal over conflict, peace over vindication, dignity over defending his reputation against accusations he could not disprove, because they were not really about facts but were about fear, not really about what he did but about what he might do, not really about evidence but about ideology that insisted no citizen should be so successful that others felt inferior, that insisted equality was more important than acknowledging excellence, that insisted that reputation for genius was itself suspicious, because in republic everyone should be ordinary and anyone extraordinary was potential threat. The silence continues, the waves break. The villa crumbles into ruins that tourists do not visit because location is uncertain, and because Scipio is not Caesar, is not famous enough to draw crowds, is known to specialists and students of military history, but is not household name despite having achieved more than many whose names are better known, despite having saved Rome from Hannibal when no one else could, despite having transformed Roman warfare and having demonstrated that learning from enemies and adapting their methods can defeat the masters who invented those methods. The exile, the silence, the withdrawal that was choice and constraint and wisdom and tragedy. The man who saved Rome and could not save himself from Rome's suspicions, who won every battle and lost the peace, who conquered Carthage and could not conquer the political dynamics that made Republican Rome unable to honor its greatest general without fearing what that greatness might threaten. At Liternum, the tomb of Scipio Africanus stands or stood, for sources disagree about whether it still exists in identifiable form, whether it was destroyed by time or vandalism or simply lost to memory as centuries passed and as pilgrims stopped coming, and as the location faded from knowledge that each generation passes to the next. The uncertainty is fitting, is appropriate ending for man whose relationship with Rome was always ambiguous, who was celebrated and suspected, honored and feared, remembered and forgotten, whose greatest achievement was saving the Republic but whose reward was exile from the city he saved, whose fame should have guaranteed eternal memory but who instead fades into the kind of obscurity that Rome reserved for those who were too successful, too necessary, too dangerous to Republican virtue. The tomb itself, when it existed and could be visited, was modest according to ancient sources that mention it. No grand mausoleum, no monument intended to overwhelm or to proclaim greatness through architectural scale, no attempt to compete with the tombs that lined the Appian Way where wealthy Romans built structures designed to impress travelers, and to ensure that the deceased's name and accomplishments would be remembered by passers-by who read the inscriptions and admired the architecture. Scipio's tomb at Liternum was simple marker, was stone indicating that here rests the conqueror of Hannibal, was memorial that relied on the achievement itself rather than on architectural grandeur to communicate significance, was exactly what one might expect from the man who lived in modest villa and who rejected the ostentation that other Romans considered appropriate to their status. The simplicity speaks volumes about Scipio's character, or at least about how he wanted to be remembered not as wealthy aristocrat who accumulated riches, not as political figure who dominated Senate, not as tyrant who threatened republic, but as general who did his duty, who served when called, who achieved what needed achieving, who saved Rome when Rome needed saving. Who then withdrew rather than demanding rewards or honors or positions that his service should have earned, but that republic could not grant without fearing what granting them might enable. The modest tomb is final statement from man who understood that republican virtue required modesty even from especially from those whose achievements were immodest, whose successes exceeded what ordinary citizens achieved, who demonstrated through victory what republic claimed was impossible, that individuals matter, that genius exists, that some citizens are superior to others in capabilities if not in political rights. But the tomb also speaks of tragedy, of disconnect between achievement and recognition, between what Scipio did for Rome and how Rome treated him, between the salvation he provided and the suspicion he received, between the triumph that celebrated his victory and the exile that followed when celebration faded and fear emerged. The modest tomb testifies to rejection, to the reality that Rome could not honor its greatest general without betraying its principles, could not acknowledge that Scipio saved the Republic without admitting that individuals can be essential in ways that Republican ideology denied, could not properly reward the man who defeated Hannibal without creating precedent where successful generals expected rewards that threatened senatorial authority and collective governance. We stand where the tomb was or might have been. The location is disputed. Scholars disagree. Archaeological evidence is insufficient or ambiguous. Centuries of coastal development have transformed the landscape until finding ancient villa and tomb among modern buildings and roads is impossible or requires excavation that no one has funded or prioritized, because Scipio is not famous enough to justify the expense, because other Roman sites have better claims on limited archaeological resources. Because the tomb of the man who saved Rome matters less than the monuments of those who destroyed Rome, because Caesar's fame eclipses Africanus's achievement despite Africanus having accomplished more for Rome than Caesar ever did. The irony is profound. Caesar, who destroyed the Republic, is remembered and honored with statues and museums and annual commemorations, while Scipio, who saved the Republic, is forgotten or at least is not remembered properly, is known to specialists but not to general public, has no major monuments, no films or popular books, no cultural presence that would suggest that he mattered, that his achievements were consequential. That Roman history would have been fundamentally different if he had failed at Zama, if Hannibal had won, if Carthage had defeated Rome and had imposed peace terms that reduced Roman power, and that prevented the Mediterranean empire that Scipio's victory made possible. The forgetting is Rome's final injustice to Scipio, not just the suspicion during life, not just the exile that forced his withdrawal, not just the investigation that questioned his honor despite his achievements, but the forgetting that followed death, the fading from memory that reduced Savior of Rome to minor figure in histories that focus on later periods, on Caesar and Augustus and the emperors who came after, on the men who destroyed what Scipio saved. Who built empire on foundations that Scipio's victory created but who never acknowledged the debt, who never recognized that their power rested on the survival that Scipio secured when survival was uncertain, and when Rome's future was determined at Zama, where student defeated master and where Roman dominance began. We listen to the silence where the tomb stands or stood, where the man who saved Rome rests or rested, where memory should be preserved but has been lost or diminished or confused. The silence speaks eloquently, speaks of ingratitude, speaks of republican fear of greatness, speaks of the price that heroes pay when they succeed too completely, when they demonstrate too clearly that institutions depend on individuals, when they prove that sometimes one person's genius matters more than collective wisdom. When they show that equality is comfortable fiction, and that merit is uncomfortable truth that republics prefer not to acknowledge, because acknowledging it threatens the ideological foundations that justify republican governance. But the silence also speaks of something deeper, speaks of the fundamental tension between individual achievement and collective governance, between honoring excellence and maintaining equality, between recognizing that some citizens are more capable than others and insisting that all citizens are equal before law and in political rights, between celebrating heroes and fearing what heroism might lead to if heroes decide that their achievements entitle them to power, that their service justifies their rule. That saving the republic gives them right to govern the republic they saved. The tension is not unique to Rome, is challenge that every republic and democracy faces when confronted with individuals whose achievements exceed normal bounds, whose capabilities threaten comfortable assumptions about equality, whose success creates questions about whether systems that work for ordinary citizens can accommodate extraordinary ones. Scipio faced this tension, became its victim, demonstrates its tragic potential, the man too successful for the system to honor properly, too necessary for the system to eliminate, too dangerous for the system to fully trust, forced into exile that was voluntary but also necessary, that was choice but also constraint. That was wisdom but also tragedy, because the alternative, remaining in Rome and fighting for recognition and vindication, would have divided the city and would have created civil conflicts that would have harmed the republic that Scipio fought to preserve. The choice to withdraw, to accept exile, to live quietly at Liternum until death, to be buried far from Rome, to rest where his bones remain or do not remain because the tomb is lost or destroyed or forgotten, this choice is Scipio's final service to Rome, is recognition that sometimes serving the Republic means sacrificing yourself to the Republic's fears, means accepting that the reward for salvation is suspicion. Means understanding that republican virtue sometimes requires the best citizens to accept treatment that they do not deserve, because insisting on proper treatment would harm the republic more than the personal injustice harms the individual. Sleep now. The journey through Scipio's life is complete. We have walked with him from Ticinus, where teenage boy saved his father, through Cannae, where he learned from defeat, through the vow that bound him to Rome's defense, through Spain, where he proved his genius, through Zama, where he defeated Hannibal, through the triumph that became suspicion, through the exile that was chosen but necessary, to the tomb where silence speaks more eloquently than any monument, where absence testifies better than presence, where forgetting becomes memory's truest form. Scipio Africanus. The savior whom Rome feared, the victor whom Rome exiled, the general who conquered Carthage and conquered silence, the man who saved the Republic but whom the Republic could not save from its own ideological contradictions, its own fears, its own inability to honor greatness without suspecting it, to celebrate achievement without fearing it, to acknowledge that individuals matter without abandoning the principle that all citizens are equal. Rest now. The tomb is silent or lost. The achievements remain even when tomb is gone. The victory at Zama stands in history books even when Scipio fades from memory. The Republic survived because of him even though Republic could not properly honor him. The tragedy is complete. The hero dies in exile. The savior is forgotten. The greatest general of his age rests in tomb that history cannot locate, in silence that no one breaks, in obscurity that seems unjust but that was inevitable given Republican Rome's inability to reconcile its need for heroes with its fear of what heroes might become. Good night. Sleep in knowledge that service is sometimes rewarded with suspicion, that salvation sometimes earns exile, that the greatest achievements sometimes bring the greatest complications, that saving the Republic sometimes means accepting that the Republic cannot honor you properly because honoring you threatens what you saved. Scipio understood, made the choice, lived with consequences, died in peace if not in honor. Rests in silence that speaks eloquently of tragedy and wisdom, sacrifice and service, the price of greatness and the cost of excellence in systems built on equality that cannot fully accommodate those who demonstrate that equality is noble aspiration but uncomfortable fiction when confronted with reality that some humans achieve more, contribute more, matter more than ideology admits or than politics can properly acknowledge. The tomb where silence speaks. The general who conquered Carthage and conquered silence, the exile who chose dignity over conflict, the hero whom Rome celebrated and suspected and finally forgot, Scipio Africanus, forever victorious, forever exiled. A forever teaching that sometimes the reward for saving the Republic is being rejected by the Republic, that sometimes serving the nation means accepting that the nation cannot properly honor the service, that sometimes the price of excellence is suspicion, exile, and being forgotten by those you saved. Good night, the silence continues. The tomb stands or falls, the memory fades or persists. But the lesson endures. Greatness is dangerous, excellence threatens equality, heroes save republics but republics cannot save heroes from their own success, from the suspicions their achievements generate, from the exile that becomes inevitable when service succeeds too completely and when saviors become threats simply by being too necessary, too capable, too superior to those they serve. Sleep well, Scipio rests. Rome endures, the tragedy is complete. Good night.